And the substance of the fight was, on the one hand, you had the folks who advocated for bringing the spirit of life into the sanctuary by painting the walls a warm lilac color. And then on the other side were the people who insisted that bold aubergine was really the only path toward spiritual wholeness, right? I kid you not. I'm sure this congregation has never had a fight about anything important. But it turns out that we all have really big feelings about our congregations and our spiritual homes. So if you can imagine, back in 1960, as the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America were talking about merging, it was not always smooth sailing, right? There was a massive negotiation to figure out what kind of church these two bodies were going to create together. So at the first General Assembly in 1961, this commission on merger that had been tasked with guiding the process, they presented a set of bylaws for this newly formed Unitarian Universalist Association. And among other things, these bylaws enumerated the new UUA's corporate purposes, so they were called. Most of which will likely ring a bell if you ever read our contemporary 7 principles. Okay, this is all in the second article, Article 2, of those original UUA bylaws. And back in 1961, they included things like to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship, and to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. Sound familiar? They're not so different. But then there was this third piece. And this one was to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. Now, all of that is together, and one of these things is not like the other, because out of the 6 purposes in those 1961 bylaws, this is the only one that starts with a religious belief, right? They talk about the supreme worth of every human personality and the dignity of man. We will forgive them their sexist language of the time. They did a whole lot of struggling with that in a few years. This belief draws from both the Universalist and the Unitarian legacies. And if you're ready for a $1 million seminary term, this is what we call our theological anthropology, right? It's what we believe about human nature, how people are created, what our relationship is to each other and to the divine, however we imagine that. And our theological anthropology of inherent worth and dignity, right? Every time we say that first principle now, we are speaking aloud our theological anthropology. But this inherent worth and dignity piece, rather than depravity and sin, that is what fundamentally separated so-called liberal religion from other forms of Christianity for many hundreds of years. You have to remember that both Universalism and Unitarianism were strands of Christianity. So then, from this grand and lofty assertion about human nature and how we're fundamentally good, the writers of these bylaws immediately veer into a form of governance. So listen to it again. To affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. So it's an if-then statement, right? If we believe that humans are endowed with inalienable worth and dignity, then we must create institutions and societies in which every person is equally empowered to determine together what happens to the people. If the people are born with agency and conscience, those twin blessings, then they must be trusted to govern themselves. So neither the Universalists nor the Unitarians had ever mentioned democracy in any of their covenants or statements of belief before the merger. But now think about this group. They're meeting in 1960 to start drafting this, right? So all of the folks on that commission had just lived through the past 2 decades of the rise of global fascism, authoritarianism, the World War that had just revealed the depths of human evil in the dropping of the atomic bomb and the Holocaust. America had just gotten through the hysteria of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and also the rise of the civil rights movement. So is it any wonder that the original purposes boldly talk about this theological anthropology of inherent worth and dignity and pair it with the practice of democracy as the truest way to understand and to honor that understanding of human nature? The word lovers among us, of course, know that democracy comes from the ancient Greek, demos, the people, and kratia, power or rule. And democracy simply just means the system of government by which the people rule themselves. If you were like me and had to memorize the Gettysburg Address at some point, and you're like, did anybody have to do that? Yeah, right? You will remember that perhaps the most famous definition of democracy is usually attributed to Abraham Lincoln. The Gettysburg Address ends that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth, right? But did you know that Lincoln stole those words from a speech by the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker? 1850, Theodore Parker goes to the New England Anti-Slavery Society and the convention that was happening that year, and he got up and preached a fiery speech about how the brutality of chattel slavery was directly at odds with what he called this 3-part American idea, which is that all people are created equal and have certain inalienable rights, and therefore the government's job is to ensure that everyone can access and enjoy these rights. And he ends his speech by saying, Parker does, this idea demands a democracy, that is, government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. Of course, you noticed that Parker has one word there that Lincoln omits. And that omission could be the story of this nation, right? A country that aspires to liberty and justice for all of us, but whose leaders have consistently failed to create the conditions of possibility for such a reality. For those among us who are poor or undocumented or Black or Indigenous or queer or people of color or trans or female or, right? In the words of Langston Hughes, America was never America to me. But for Parker, and for so many political philosophers and theologians before and since, even though our society has yet to realize its promise, democracy still remains our best hope for a truly equitable society with liberty and justice for all. Why? Again, it's because of our theological anthropology. While our Universalist and Unitarian traditions rejected the notion of original sin and depravity, we acknowledge that humans can commit evil, hurt people. But because of our deep belief that we are all born from a deep love that never lets us go, we believe that the people as a whole, en masse, retain an unbreakable connection to that same source of goodness and creativity. So we trust neither Messiah nor monarch, but we trust that the more of all the people who get to decide what is done to all the people, the more likely that we will err on the side of mutual care and support and freedom for all the people. So of course it makes sense that democracy holds such a central place in modern day Unitarian Universalism. As you know, our current principles include a commitment to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Even though our society has yet to fully realize that promise, our theology proposes that robust democracy is both a religious practice and our best hope for a really equitable society. Now, I probably don't have to convince any of you that democracy is under attack here in the United States and across the globe. The strategy of the radical right, both political and religious, is to make it legal for a small group of people to control the bodies and restrict the agency of the rest of the people. But I want to suggest that the task of resuscitating and reimagining and reincarnating democracy is fundamentally a religious task. And it is, in fact, the most urgent of our time. As religious leaders and spiritual communities, our faith calls us to the holy work of building a society in which the potential that is inborn in each of us is actually realizable by all of us. And I want to be clear that I am very much a cynic about all of the forms that real democracy has taken so far in human history. I am very far from an institutionalist and a loyalist to systems of government. But when it comes to democracy, its promise lies not in our belief that institutions are infallible or perfect, but that people together will gravitate toward the common good, and that collectively we are better than each of our individual parts. As Chuck mentioned, in my paid work, I serve as the organizing strategy director at the UUA. And in that work, that's a lot of fancy words for basically saying I lead the team that holds Side with Love, the national social justice arm of the UUA, and all of our campaigns, including Create Climate Justice, UPLIFT Action, which is our LGBTQ, gender, and reproductive justice campaign, UzU the Vote, which is our democracy campaign, and Love Resists, which is our anti-criminalization campaign. And as you can imagine, things are rather busy in my office right now. So far, Unitarian Universalists participating in UzU the Vote have made nearly 2 million phone calls and door knocks and postcards and letters to voters, encouraging people to vote our values, to mobilize, to get out the vote, and to defend our democracy. And of course, that is what democracy looks like. But it also looks like the congregation that opens its doors to a family of migrants who are seeking asylum, or in Louisville or Rochester, New York, congregations that have opened their sanctuaries to protesters who are being pursued by police in Black Lives Matter protests. Democracy looks like multi-faith coalitions creating networks of hospitality and resources so that everybody can access abortion and gender-affirming care regardless of where they live. Democracy looks like providing supplies and childcare and cooking and doing jail support and risking arrest alongside the water protectors. That spiritual practice of democracy takes many forms. Over and over again, I feel personally saved, to the extent that I believe in such a thing, by watching both Unitarian Universalists and our broader movements for justice continue to show up again and again to create the conditions of possibility for all of us to thrive. And from watching this work and learning from it, I can distill 3 basic imperatives for practicing democracy as a collective spiritual discipline and a religious act, which of course I'm going to share with you because I'm a preacher and so I gotta have a 3, right? Number 1, we have to recommit to the things that are worthy of our ultimate loyalty. 9 years before that of the People's Speech, Theodore Parker famously preached a sermon called "The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity." And he basically scolded the church for being a bunch of dummies who were fighting about the way that the paint was on the walls of the congregation and who was going to be the charge of the board. And he said, what is permanent is not how we're practicing right now or what our building looks like, but we have to stop squabbling over forms and doctrines and refocus on embodying love for the divine by enacting love for our human kin. So 2 centuries later, we might reimagine that call as a command to let go of the things that no longer serve us and focus on the new structures and new practices that allow us to better embody our values. And in fact, we are doing this right now, right? We no longer require the spiritual community to be in person in a building that you own on Sunday morning where the same group of people gather all the time, right? The fact that we are in a multi-platform world is an adaptation that is bringing us into a new era. Number 2 is that we have to have a broader field of vision than what happens within our individual congregations. The collective human crises that we are facing will not wait while we are busy squabbling over whether we can borrow from the reserve fund or how we're going to restructure the program of the church or whether to adopt the 8th principle. And if more of our congregational energy is going toward maintaining our own institutions than towards building the world as it should be, then we have failed. The natural, faithful response to being endowed with both freedom and dignity is to find your people, to build relationships and trust, to collectively and courageously take up the work of fighting for a world in which all of us are free and flourishing. And number 3, if I am ever buried in a place where there is a stone marker, I hope that this is my epitaph. We have to take shifts for the revolution. The enterprise of incarnating the beloved community is work that we are neither responsible for by ourselves nor free to abandon. So we find the intersection of the world's need with our skills and passion. As religious communities, we help the people that we serve to find theirs. Some of us make art. Some of us organize our neighborhoods. Some of us raise money or build the spreadsheet or host the Zoom meeting. Some of us donate. We provide childcare. We get arrested at a direct action. We run for city council. But we have to find our shift, connect with our people, expand your personal comfort zone, and take your shift. When you're done, go rest and pray and let yourself be held and cared for so that you're ready to clock in when the next shift starts. And trust that the others that you've been building community with are now going to step in and take their shift too. When I watch the news or when I go on Twitter, I do not recommend, I feel that the urgency is so big and the heartbreak is unrelenting. And the stakes are so very high. But like our religious ancestors, our faith reminds us that even in the face of all this brokenness, the biggest possible we is the beloved community of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. And that is an aspiration that is worthy of our deepest commitment and our fiercest loyalty. The spiritual practice of embodying and building and fighting for true democracy is a source of hope and a path toward our collective liberation. So may we be blessed, each and all of us, as we build together. May it be so. Blessed be, Ashe, and Amen.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It was lovely. Let's do our second hymn, which is Love Will Guide Us. And if you are so inclined, we'd like to have a little congregational back and forth.
What's the number?
131. You know it by heart.
There's only two sets of words.
Not everybody does.
Right. All right. I can borrow the podium there.
Please, go right ahead, I'll move out of your way.
All right, hopefully my guitar strap will stay attached, but you know what? We sound great with or without, so welcome. Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us, leading the way on the road from grief to giving. Love will guide us through the hard nights. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot sing it for thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from grief to giving. Love will guide us through the hard nights. Well done.
Who's got some wisdom to draw?
Well, I did not know that Theodore Parker was the original crafter of those words.
Didn't he do the Ark of Justice one
Yes,
too?
Yes, he did.
And which is always given to
To
Martin
MLK.
Luther King.
Yep.
Yes, yes.
A fun fact, in President Obama's Oval Office, you know, each president creates the design of the carpet that sits on the floor of the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And Obama's had 3 different quotes in one of the lines around it, and he had both of all the people, by all the people, for all the people, and the arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice. So he had 2 Parker quotes in his rug, neither of which are traditionally attributed to him. Theodore Parker is also one of the Secret Six, who are a cabal of Boston, mostly Unitarians, who funded the raid, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So there's a lot of really interesting. He's a fascinating person. Yeah.
Well, I didn't have so much of wisdom, but I'm just fascinated by this group that were created, the Unitarians and the Universalists, and got together and sat down and thought about it, because they wouldn't have had experience to have ever done anything like that before, and it would have been fascinating to be one of those people.
Or to be a fly on the wall.
Right.
But just what was given to them to do, and it just, I'm envious.
Yeah.
But.
And they were so different in many ways. The theological beliefs were not all that different, but the cultures, right? So Universalism was a much more working class. We were more like the Baptists than we were like the Unitarians in terms of just the practice and the polity, right? So the way that folks were governed, the Universalists were much more like the Baptists than the Unitarians. And the Unitarians had this reputation as the Boston Brahmins, right? Like the very elite, sort of intellectual. And by the time that they were doing this, we'd already gone through the humanist movement and all this stuff.
Right.
And the Universalists were still much more Christian at that point. And so even the conversation, are we going to be the Universalist Unitarians or the Unitarian Universalists, was huge. So I talked about this congregation that I served in Joliet that was the Universalist Unitarian Church of Joliet, very intentionally. They were still mad.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that.
Hanging on. Yeah. Well, even to this day, there's those differences, isn't there, between the First Universalist and First Unitarian in Minneapolis?
Yeah.
Or humanist or whatever.
Yep.
Just over the last week, so this is very timely for me, I've been reading Eboo Patel's Interfaith Leadership book. And one of the things that, I mean, everything that you said was like, oh, and that fits, and that fits. But most recently, he's talking about the theory of the interfaith, what that means. And he talked about there's kind of 4 possible outcomes of a religious group, community. Oftentimes, one of the things is, well, when you're talking about interfaith interactions, right? One is creating barriers because I'm right and you guys are not right. And so we're not going to talk with you or divisive or whatever. So it's barriers, or it's bunkers, which is I'm right, you're wrong, and I got to protect myself from you. And the third is bludgeoning, which is the violent one. And then the fourth one is bridging. And they also talk about how the churches, a church community, a faith community, creates social capital. And that's why we continue to come to these churches. And it can be one of 2 kinds. It can be social capital that bonds people together, right? That you have a sense of belonging, you feel together. But that can also be divisive if you are too cliquey. And the other social capital is the bridging. Again, so that terminology comes back. And that's what, and you can have both. And you need both. You need to have that cohesiveness, but you also can't stop there, and you have to have that action, like you talked about, of going out to the community, to the world, and finding the common good. Basically.
And I'm always fascinated too, and maybe I'm just not spiritually mature enough for this, but like, I, as a queer person, for example, in a multiracial family, have no idea, have no intention or desire to sit down and bridge with a white supremacist or somebody who thinks that God is condemning me to hell because I'm queer, right? And, for example, I have a lot of admiration for the political strategies that the radical right has implemented over the past 40 years because, man, they have won, right? They've been super smart about things. So there are ways in which I want to learn from folks who are drastically different than me, but I think I really appreciate the sort of 4 quadrants because like there are times at which it is in fact appropriate to be bunkery, right? I'm going to hold those trans kids. I am not going to put them in front of the evangelicals who are trying to kill them. Nope. And then there are times when, of course, you know, like the marriage amendment I'm thinking about, the way the tactic that made that happen here in Minnesota was deep personal conversations. Where it was people who were like, do you see me? I'm a human. I have children who look like yours. I live on your block. I'm your neighbor. And I happen to be gay. And it actually did shift hearts and minds. It's fascinating to think about the balance, how we balance those things, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and shout out to Karen, who's online here, did that and was featured in that movie, How Love Won.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Karen. Well, I will end then by just inviting all of you, if you haven't gotten engaged with UzU the Vote yet, there are still a bunch of opportunities in this coming.
We did postcards here.
Fabulous, thank you. It has been so cool watching the numbers roll in and also being a part of, like, there are still phone banks and text banks that are happening. Even if you are not, you know, it's not like texting from your own phone. You press a button on your computer, there's an anonymous number, you invite people to go vote. Some people flip you the bird, but most of the time people are actually really grateful for some contact. So there's opportunities very, very frequently over the next couple of weeks. If you go to uzuthevote.org, invite you to get connected and to engage with this work. And I will say that when I came on to Side with Love, I was pretty uninterested in electoral work. And it turned out that President Susan Frederick Gray gave me this project of developing UzU the Vote as the first assignment she gave me. And then I hired Nicole Presley, who's the genius behind all of it, which was my greatest accomplishment. But it has become so clear to me these past few years, and especially, with the overturn of Roe, with the threats to Obergefell, for example, around gay marriage. These victories are going to be hyper-local right now. Yeah. It matters who is on, the Republican Steve Bannon's strategy right now of get a bunch of MAGA Republicans on your precinct committee, right? Mm-hmm. So the lowest levels of things are up for grabs, and I really have come to believe what I preached today, which is that the practice of democracy together is, in fact, a deeply spiritual commitment, and it is the time, friends. So let's all take our shifts.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Please.
If anyone is interested in a yard sign, there's Campaign headquarters is on the Burnsville Parkway, right across from Jensen's Cafe. If you want a yard sign.
Cool.
For
whoever.
Anybody that's open.
I would, but I live on a dead-end street. It's only the mailman and the garbage truck.
You stick it in your back windshield.
Yeah, I thought, I've done that before, yes. Right.
Do you have a closing reading, or you got any closing wisdom you want to share?
Well, I can certainly give a blessing, or if you have one that's picked up. So friends, as we head into these next couple of weeks, especially as we hold all of the things that are moving so quickly, both on just tiny micro scales and on the macro scale of the world right now, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the politics happening in our own backyards, I think this is a moment where it's worth us taking a breath and remembering what connects us to that love from which we come, from which we cannot be separated, and that makes this beautiful and broken world worth saving. All of us have a role to play in that. All of us deserve love and care and rest, and all of us have something to contribute. And as we go into this time, I pray for all of you the wisdom to know what your work is, the blessing of finding the people who will do it with you, and the courage to keep going. May all of you be blessed, and you are already all blessings. Be well. Amen. Okay.